The first session of the 2021 Ohio Beef Cattle Management School was hosted via Zoom by the Ohio State University Extension Beef Team on January 18th and focused on making quality hay for beef cattle with an emphasis on soil fertility and seed species selection when doing a new seeding. During this 10-minute excerpt from that evening's presentation, Noble County Extension Educator Christine Gelley discusses considerations for seed species selection. Let's listen in as Christine shares the virtues of the grass and legume species that Ohio's cattlemen may consider planting for a new hay stand.
Something to keep in mind too, looking at those mixes, is once you get more than 5 species in your mix, count on some of those dropping out 3 to 5 years down the road, because those plants will compete with each other as well. Usually you will wind up with 3 to 5 really competitive and persistent forages in the stand. The others may hang around a little bit, but don't count on them pulling their weight for the long term. So going into those super fancy mixes may not have a long-term benefit for you. So try to keep it practical with the ones that suit your equipment and make sense in your feeding program. And shop for them ahead of time. Don't just walk into the feed store the week you want to plant and ask them for a good beef hay mix, because they will sell you whatever's on the shelf that they sell in their catalog and their brand line. Whatever's in stock, that's what you're going to get. And that may not be the best choice for you. So take the time right now here in January to gather up some seed catalogs, read about the different varieties of each type of forage, and choose the one that you like the best. You can look at things like seeding rates. You look at things like maturity rate. We have late maturing and early maturing. And you may make those choices based on if you're going to hay or graze. There's so much versatility out there when you look at different types of forages. If you don't give yourself this benefit of shopping ahead of time, um, you're not going to wind up choosing the forage that's really best suited for you. So get those catalogs and start taking a look. Now, when it gets to more specific options, I've got some of the most common perennial grass options here for Ohio listed, along with their seeding rate, their recommended planting date, and their planting depth. And I'll just go through this chart and give you some specifics about each one. We could talk for a half an hour more about each one, but we'll keep it really short. So, Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass is a very short growing perennial grass. It is ideal for situations where you know that you're going to be cutting the system quite low or grazing frequently. It does pretty good with frequent abuse. It'll bounce back, um, and it does fairly well in some challenging fertility situations. Um, so this one I recommend a lot in areas where we know that our equipment maybe doesn't have as high of a cutting ability, and we know we're going to be harvesting close to the ground. Note the planting depth on all of these. None of them on here, these perennial grass mixes, should be seeded at greater than a half an inch. A half an inch is not very deep. And um, that's one of the most common causes of stand failures when we seed forages is seeding too deep. So pay very close attention to these seeding depths, both when you are selecting your forages and when you're selecting the equipment that you'll use to plant them. Orchard grass is one of the most common that we see used in hay mixes for all types of species. It is reliable. It has proven the test of time. We know how to use it. We know how to feed it. When you're looking at types of orchard grass, in most cases, I would suggest going with a late maturing orchard grass. What that's going to do is give you more time to get into the field and harvest it before the seed heads come on. And experiencing these springs that are abnormally wet for a long period of time, we need all the time that we can buy when it comes to um, beating the seed head emergence. Perennial ryegrass. Now, perennial ryegrass is one that we kind of have a love-hate relationship with when you're on the border of southern and northern Ohio. And I-70 seems to be kind of the cutoff point of the state where perennial rye either does really well or struggles. I'm on the southern half of I-70, but I'm sure many of you listening are on the northern half. And perennial rye seems to do really well in the northern half of Ohio, but the southern half tends to struggle. It is not very persistent to drought, and it tends to go dormant for most of the summer, more so in the southern half than the northern half. When we use perennial rye mixes down here, what we tend to see is they get outcompeted by the other grasses in the stand. However, it is a very palatable forage. It is easy to establish, it's vigorous, and it can produce really nice hay. It does have it can be hard to dry down, but it's a very pretty looking grass in the stand. But I would be cautious if you're in the southern half. Reed canary grass. This one is often considered a noxious weed, so it may seem odd that it's on the list here. But reed canary grass has its benefits, and as you may guess by its name, it grows pretty well in wet spots. And we've been finding many wet spots here in the past 5 years that I've been with Extension. That's one of the most common complaints I hear is that the soils in this area are too soggy and I can't keep anything in the stand. It's just weeds. Well, reed canary grass does not mind wet feet, and it is extremely competitive, very vigorous once you get the seed started. So containment is something we need to keep in mind with reed canary grass. It does like to travel down waterways, but it can be very beneficial in those areas that are chronically wet for much of the season. Smooth brome grass is less common, but I think it deserves a little bit more attention. Smooth brome is much different than that broom grass or broom sedge that you see out in the pasture. Not the same, but often confused. Smooth grass is a very palatable, soft textured grass that does quite well in many situations. It's not as persistent as the others, but if you see that in a beef mix, I would be confident using it in most cases. Tall fescue. Now, tall fescue, again, we've got a love-hate relationship, a strong one here with tall fescue. Tall fescue, Kentucky 31, has caused many issues for beef producers for years, decades. And that has to do with that endophyte that lives inside the forage. Our Kentucky 31 tall fescue, which is likely the fescue growing alongside every roadway in Ohio and somewhere in a pasture field near you, um, that endophyte aids the plant in times of stress. It allows it to be more tolerant to drought, more tolerant to uh, soggy conditions. It makes it able to bounce back from grazing quite well. But that endophyte causes vascular constriction in grazing animals when consumed in fairly high quantities. So, the best option with tall fescue, if you're looking at establishing a new stand, is to use a novel endophyte variety. The novel endophyte varieties have an endophyte inside that aids the plant, but does not have the anti-quality factors for livestock. It tends to be pretty persistent. We've heard very good things about its utilization, but it is quite a bit more expensive than that Kentucky 31 variety. There's a reason. Pay the extra money. And then Timothy here is the last one on the list. A lot of people really like Timothy. I'm not as big of a fan, and that's mainly due to the persistence of Timothy. It doesn't compete super well, so if you want to put Timothy in the mix, it's great nutrition wise, but it's likely not going to hang out with the others for as long. Now, if we move on to our perennial legumes, this slide will take a lot less time, so hang there with me. I know that was a long chart. When we look at these perennial legumes, alfalfa is one we use a lot for our hay crops, but not needed as much for the common beef cow than for our dairy herds. So if you find that your soil acidity is not appropriate for alfalfa, do not dismay. There are other options that can provide some of the same benefits that alfalfa do, although maybe not as elegant when we talk about them. Most commonly, I would suggest using white clover in the mix. It's not very expensive, it's very reliable. Use a ladino clover. These are improved white clover varieties rather than the kind you'll just find growing wild out in the stands. Our Ladino white clovers have greater leaf area, so you're going to get more pounds of forage when you see these. I'm going to kind of go backwards through this chart this time. Red clover is often considered a better option for hay crops. It's taller growing, and you can really increase your crude protein values when you're using red clover in hay mixtures. Um, it's not as persistent, though. We may need to go back and reseed red clover into our stands in about 3 to 5 years, as opposed to white clover that tends to hang out for quite a bit longer. Bird's foot trefoil is an interesting one to consider using. The big benefit of bird's foot trefoil when we look at the tolerance to stressors here is that it tolerates fairly acidic soils. But we've had some trouble getting this one established. It doesn't like fall seeding. It doesn't frost seed very well. So really, if you're going to seed bird's foot, you need to do it in the spring, pretty early in the spring, as you can see from the chart. So if you miss that planting window and you try to squeeze it in somewhere else, it's probably not going to succeed very well for you. But in some cases, it's been very successful. But of the options on this list, bird's foot is the most tolerant to low pH.